we're on there, yeah. Before we begin, can I remind members to turn off their mobile phones completely as they interfere with the recording equipment, and the main business of today's proceedings will start shortly, but I have to deal now with the minutes of the 29th of May 2019 have been circulated. Are there any matters arising? No matters arising. Correspondence 2019-456, email from the Office of the Minister of Transport concerning a number of appointments. One is the reappointment of the Chairperson Board of Fáilte Ireland, and also at the Chairman of the Port of Waterford, and is that it, just one appointment there? So if it's agreed, we'll have them in before the summer recess. Agreed. Correspondence 2019-472 A and B, email from Colin McGinty, Sport Ireland, regarding the the planned memorandum, Module 1 of the COSI Corporation's extensive independent audit of the Football Association of Ireland, and B, their planning memorandum for Module 1. It is proposed to note this correspondence, which we discussed in private session. Is that agreed? Agreed. Correspondence 2019-473 A and B, emailed from Donald McAuliffe, dated 29th of May, attaching a submission concerning the national identity in sport and international politics. It is proposed to note this correspondence. Is that agreed? Agreed. Correspondence 2019-474, emailed from Cormac O'Donoghue, Cathaoirleach, CLG na Fianna, regarding an independent social value report of what the coordinated volunteer efforts of the club add to the local community. Proposed to note this correspondence. Agreed. Agreed. Correspondence 2019-475 A and B, email from Colin McGinty, Sport Ireland, replying to email from the clerk of the committee and attaching a briefing document and then the actual document. It's proposed to note this correspondence discussed in private. Is that agreed? Agreed. Correspondence 2019-476, email from Tom Newton and Katrina McLean, dated 5th of June, concerning route alterations to bus route 239. It's proposed to note this correspondence. Agreed. Correspondence 2019-477 A, B, C and D, emailed from Eilish Fannin, Public Accounts Committee. 3 documents from and B, letter from Kieran Lennon, Clerk to Public Accounts. A copy of email from Jim Comiskey regarding Bus Connect, an email from Rob Comiskey regarding Core Bus Corridor Project. Proposed to note this correspondence. Is that agreed? Agreed. Excuse me. Correspondence 2019-478, correspondence between Paul Kelly, Clerk to our Committee, and Peter Hogan, Sports Policy and National Sports Campus, Department of Tourism and Transport, dated 30th May, concerning invitations to the joint stakeholders meeting hosted by Minister Ross in the Mansion House. That's over. We note that correspondence. Members were there. Correspondence from Barry Kenny, Irish Rail, relating to an email from Donald O'Brien, and note that correspondence. That agreed? Agreed. Correspondence 2019-480. Now, this is from email from Larry Larkin, dated the 12th of June, regarding a meeting with the Joint Committee to discuss the anomaly regarding the representation of Irish athletes competing in international competitions. And that was also raised by Deputy Munster, isn't that correct? So we hope to have a date for that meeting before the recess. And we'll get back to members if that's agreed. Agreed. Correspondence from me, from Kieran Riley, from attaching document regarding concerns about electric vehicle fires. Could I propose that we note that correspondence? We might send it to, is there a Chief Fire Officer, or who would you send it to, just for their opinion on it? Pardon? We'll get to that soon. Yeah, we'll do that, just to get a professional opinion. Correspondence 2019-482, email from Paul Allen regarding the recent Dublin Port revelations. Proposed to note this correspondence, which we discussed earlier in private session. Agreed. Now, Deputy Coppinger, your email dated the 18th of June, that the Joint Committee have an entire session on free public transport. So, Deputy Coppinger, to discuss.
Yeah, I know we're about to have a discussion on transport proposals, but actually one of the glaring omissions from the government's publication the other day was the concept of free public transport, which many cities worldwide are moving to, and even now Luxembourg, the first country, I think, in its entirety. So this is absolutely vital for climate change if we're to tackle and meet the demand for less carbon emissions. And it would also free up in terms of congestion, which is a major issue in many of our cities, particularly Dublin, particularly suburbs where I come from. Yesterday it took me about an hour and 15 minutes to get home from here to Blanchardstown, and that's, you know, a daily commute, even longer for people every day. So I just think that instead of punitive measures, which is largely what seems to be contained in the government's proposal, where they're talking about having higher car parking charges if your vehicle is, you know, higher in emissions. They're talking about, you know, such measures like that. That's fine, but if you don't have the money and the wherewithal to switch to lower vehicular use, but also we don't have the public transport in this country to allow people to get out of their cars. That's the reality. I discussed here, we've 110,000 people in Blanchardstown. We've no light rail, no Lewis, no metro. It's purely bus dependent. I mean, there is a rail line that serves some of the area, but that tends to be inaccessible from where most people live, and the industrial areas that are there as well. So the reason I think actually we need probably even more than one session, if this committee is serious about contributing to the global, you know, emergency that's now recognised by young people and in the recent general election, it is something we should consider. And there's cities that we could look at, are there expert witnesses that we could invite people from? Tallinn in Estonia, Dunkirk in France is a city that's gone free public transport, Luxembourg, and also many cities in Poland. It seems to be quite widespread there. And so I think that I'd ask the members to support that idea. Obviously, we could put together some proposals. As
I think that's a very good idea. I presume members would agree that we would do that. And could you, so will you talk to the clerk and arrange dates? Now, it may be after the recess. I don't know what the time. We seem to be pretty full up right now. But just on the point you raised there, I spoke to the NTA about, you know, just informally, you know, that we should visit and look at some of those cities, you know, as a transport committee to see what is best practice and how it works. So we can part of our committee deliberations, we can come back on that maybe next week as well. And
just to say, obviously, it would require investment. You know, there's no point in if everyone got out of their cars tomorrow, we wouldn't have the transport.
If you suggested clerk to witnesses that you'd like to have in, okay, so we'll go ahead with that. So we'll add those to the committee's work programme. Is that agreed? We'll now move on to EU scrutiny. Sorry, Paul. I'm sorry. Correspondence item 2019-484 email from Deputy Eamon Ryan. Requesting chance for TII to be invited to appear before the committee. Deputy Ryan to discuss.
You know, it's again coming from similar colleagues in the areas that Deputy Coppinger was talking about, who are suffering very significantly from air and noise pollution. Particularly, that air pollution issue is increasingly significant, and it's to ask officials to come in to investigate that. I think would be very useful use of the committee's time.
Okay, so that's the TII. You're talking about the.
That's right.
So that's a specific agenda you'd like them. That's fine. Okay, we'll add that to our meetings as well. Again, the problem is it might be the autumn. Yeah, but you're happy with that. Okay, well, is that agreed then? Agreed. Okay, EU scrutiny, Schedule B, COM 201682, 2017-275, 2017-647, 2017-676, 2018-568. Proposed that these items listed in Schedule B warrant no further scrutiny. Is that agreed? Agreed. Now we eventually get to our witnesses. So good morning again. We're now resumed in public session. Sorry, this is just what was written down for me to say. Can I again remind members and witnesses that we turn off our mobile phones? I'd like to particularly welcome representatives from the National Economic and Social Council and researchers from DCU School of Law and Government. We're joined by Dr. Jeanne Moore, Policy Analyst and ESE, Dr. Larry O'Connell, Senior Economist and ESE, Dr. Laura Devaney, Dublin City University School of Law and Government, Dr. Diarmuid Thorney, Dublin City University School of Law and Government. You're very welcome. Before we commence, I'm required to read this. It's just a normal process. By virtue of Section 1721 of the Defamation Act 2009, witnesses are protected by absolute privilege in respect of the evidence you are to give to the committee. However, if you are directed by the committee to cease giving evidence in relation to a particular matter and you continue to do so, you are entitled thereafter only to a qualified privilege in respect of your evidence. You are directed that only evidence connected with the subject matter of these proceedings is to be given, and you are asked to respect the parliamentary practice to the effect that, where possible, you should not criticise nor make charge against any person or persons or entity by name or in such a way as to make him or her identifiable. And members are reminded of our long-standing parliamentary practice that members should not comment on, criticise or make charge against either a person outside the Houses or an official, either by name or in such a way as to make him or her identifiable. So that's that out of the way. I now invite Dr. Gian Moore, Policy Analyst, NESC, and Dr. Larry O'Connell, Senior Economist, to make their opening statements, please.
Thank you very much, Chairperson and members of the committee, for the invitation here today. Just by way of background, to say NESC is a government body which advises the Taoiseach on strategic policy issues. Members are appointed by the Taoiseach, and they represent business, employers, trade unions, agriculture, community and voluntary organisations and environmental organisations. As well, we have heads of government departments and independent experts on our council. So the composition of NESC means that it plays an important and unique role in bringing different perspectives from civil society together with government. So Jean and myself are here as members of the Secretariat this morning. So in our view, there's a very strong and growing consensus across society and in the Oireachtas and government that ambitious and meaningful policy action is urgently required to address climate change. In the Council's latest report called Climate Policy, Getting the Process Right, we argued that what is required is a mission-orientated approach to climate that will help us to drive development of actions and solutions that will decarbonise our economy. That would allow us to capture the full range of positive benefits from what we've seen must be a just transition to a low-carbon future, to our economy, health, well-being, air quality and enhanced biodiversity. However, the Council also points out that ambitious goals like this, without rigorous and reflective policy, will not be sufficient to deliver the transition to a low-carbon future. So what the Council has focused on in its report is ensuring that the growing ambition is actually matched by action. In our view, what's required is a process of policy development and continuous improvement, which can, over time, force emissions downwards at the scale and pace we require. Very briefly, the system that we talk about uses target setting at a very specific level and action and review that will ensure that ambitious actions on climate, which will often come across difficulties, costs and contested ideas, which will need to be grappled with and not glossed over. So we accept that in many areas of climate change policy that the precise details about how we're going to act aren't yet fully worked out, but progress has still to be achieved in the face of that uncertainty. So the Council talks about continuous improvement on policy, and what that actually means for climate policy and for transport specifically is what I'll focus on for the next minute or two. So for climate policy, the Council strongly supports the Government's proposal to adopt a policy and implementation process modelled on the Action Plan for Jobs. The process it outlines in its report bears close similarity to the proposal by the Joint Oireachtas Committee on Climate Action to establish a Climate Action Implementation Board. In our view, such a process and a structure can provide the key mechanism that will allow for intensive reporting and monitoring of action. However, the existing range of known actions on climate policy, even if you implemented them fully, they will not be sufficient. So what the Council is recommending is that along with this a monitoring process in the Action Plan for Jobs, which rightly focuses on the need to check implementation and deliverables, that it should, in the case of climate change, be enhanced to make sure that government agencies actively explore, find, trial and cost new solutions for specific contexts. In doing so, the agencies government will have to engage and collaborate with each other and also with non-government actors in their respective networks. So in our view, this Action Plan for Jobs Plus process at the centre of government will then have a key role in trying to pool the learning from action at the front line in various sectors, to prompt cooperation between departments and sectors, to find and exploit the co-benefits for health, well-being and environment. In terms of transport, the Council identifies 3 key additional activities and processes that would support future climate action. First, the Council very strongly supports the role of task forces in searching for appropriate solutions. The report by Dr. Tormey and Dr. Devaney focus on the Low Emissions Vehicle Task Force in Transport as something which seems to have the capacity to do that key thing of grappling with the complexity and the uncertainty that characterises some of the actions that are required in the transport sector. In our view, such a task force that can running those task forces and learning from their work should form a core part of climate change policy and not just be tangential to it. Second, the Council highlights the role of the departmental and agency-led processes that would support breakthroughs and innovation and scale up promising solutions. They would achieve this by using the full range of tools available, including regulation, acting as a facilitator and a convener, and using the traditional instruments that shape behaviour like taxes, charges and subsidies. Finally, the Council recommends that an enhanced research and knowledge generating capacity and capability is required in transport because it's lacking in transport compared to other sectors like agriculture and energy, where Teagasc and SEAI are key resources. What the Council envisages is a research approach and capacity that's very close to practice, that helps in actually finding out new solutions and identifying obstacles and challenges to progress. The examples that we would cite are things like research trials on very practical things like parking policy, cycling and safety, how we might prioritise pedestrians in urban areas, and congestion charges. The second area is how we engage people and communities in trying to find and see the co-benefits of having a more sustainable mobility system. And the third would be that using our research to develop best practice guidelines and standards and advisory support where it's needed, for example, in creating safe walking routes in rural areas. So finally, these 3 innovations, task forces which move specific issues forward, using more of the coordinating force and instruments of the state to increase the pace of change, and an enhanced practice-orientated research programme would, in the Council's view, create the means of continuously improving the sustainability and quality of our mobility system and the wider climate process. To conclude, we thank you very much for the opportunity of coming in to present our work today, and myself and my colleague Jean Moore would be happy to answer any questions you might have. Thank you.
Thank you. Excuse me, sorry. I'd now like to call, Dr. Dermot Tormey. Sorry, does, apologies, Jean, do you want to say something first?
No, it's okay. I'm happy to answer any questions.
That's all okay, apologies there. Dr. Dermot Tormey and Dr. Laura Devaney, so in your hands now.
Yes, Chairperson, members of the committee, thank you for the invitation to present our research on advancing the low-carbon transition in Irish transport. This work was completed by myself and my colleague, Dr. Laura Devaney, of the School of Law and Government in Dublin City University. Our research was commissioned by the National Economic and Social Council, but the analysis and conclusions in our report are ours and do not necessarily represent the views of the Council or the Secretariat. I will outline the context and rationale for our study and set out the diagnosis we offer of the constraints on Ireland's transition to a low-carbon transport system. I will then hand over to Dr. Devaney, who will take you through our recommendations to overcome these constraints. The climate crisis has gained unprecedented prominence in Irish politics, media and society in recent months. This is not before time, but better late than never. Stark warnings from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change last October highlight the risks involved if we fail to limit global heating to 1.5 degrees Celsius. These risks include more extreme droughts and floods, as well as severe impacts on ecosystems and human communities. The IPCC report was equally unequivocal in highlighting that we are currently on a very dangerous pathway. The world has already warmed by approximately 1 degree Celsius, and we are currently headed for 3 degrees of heating. To have a chance of limiting heating to 1.5 degrees, we need a radical change of direction, that will bring us to zero net greenhouse gas emissions by mid-century. Young people took to the streets across the country in their thousands in March and again last month to put pressure on politicians to tackle the climate crisis that poses a grave threat to their future. The results of the recent European and local elections illustrate that climate change has indeed moved to the centre of politics. Momentum for necessary climate action is growing. However, emissions projections from the Environmental Protection Agency show that Ireland will, in a best-case scenario, achieve a 0.4% reduction in emissions in the sectors of the economy outside the EU emissions trading scheme by 2020. This compares with a 20% decarbonisation target. Nobody claims Ireland's transition to a climate-safe future will be cheap or easy. If it were, we would have done it long ago. But what is beyond doubt is that it is necessary and achievable. Ireland has struggled to decarbonise transport. Emissions from this sector fell during the recession, but have grown significantly since and remain responsible for about 20% of our national emissions. The National Economic and Social Council commissioned Dr. Devaney and myself to undertake a study of how governance structures enable or constrain low-carbon transition in Irish transport. It is important to note that in focusing on governance structures, our report does not go into the detail on what the appropriate balance is between different specific modes of transport or what specific policy instruments are best placed to spur low-carbon transition. Governance institutions, which are the focus of our study, are key enabling factors for decarbonisation across economy and society. The international literature on governance of low-carbon transition points to the importance of both bottom-up innovation and experimentation and top-down direction from central government. Drawing on desk-based research and interviews with key stakeholders across the transport system, we show how a low-carbon transition in Irish transport could be better facilitated by modifications to governance institutions and the broader policy system. There are three dimensions to our diagnosis of the challenges facing the transport sector in transitioning to a low-carbon future. First, the Irish transport sector is inherently complex. There are tensions between public and private actors in charge of different transport options, between rural and urban, and special interests play a strong role in the transport sector. Delivering transport also interacts in complex ways with broader policy systems, including where we locate our housing, schools, hospitals, and other facilities. Second, low-carbon transition is not yet a priority in transport in Ireland. Contestation between different players has shaped the development of a carbon-intensive transport system to date. There is also disagreement over what low-carbon transition might entail across different elements of the transport sector, such as between passenger and freight transport. Third, our system of transport decision-making is deeply fragmented. Authority is spread among multiple institutions whose mandates often have not kept pace with the urgency of the climate crisis. I would now like to hand over to my colleague, Dr. Laura Devaney, who will take you through our recommendations to overcome these challenges.
Thank you. Thank you. Dr. Devaney.
Thank you. Chairperson, members of the committee, thank you for the invitation to present our research today on advancing the low-carbon transition in Irish transport, which was commissioned by the National Economic and Social Council. For my statement, I wish to focus on the potential solutions uncovered by the research. We would like to note to the committee that these recommendations were developed in advance of the government's publication of the Climate Action Plan on Monday. Building on the diagnosis of the transport sector as outlined by Dr. Torney, our research identifies recommendations and poses questions for stakeholders who wish to strengthen low-carbon transition in Irish transport. These align with our three key research themes. First, acknowledging complexities in the transport sector, transport governance ought to be built upon the following principles. We need to adopt a collaborative, adaptive and reflexive approach to policy making. This requires input from a diverse range of public, private and civil society actors whose voices are not sufficiently heard. Stakeholder engagement is essential to enhance transparency, legitimacy and trust in decision making and generate better outcomes. We should support bottom-up approaches to low-carbon transport. This approach takes into account geographical and technical variations and the rural-urban divide that results in different transport solutions and investment required in different areas. We ought to understand transport as a social practice to promote positive behaviour change. This means that we consider the socio-cultural, technical and governance forces that shape our mobility choices. Designing and implementing appropriate combinations of these interventions will ensure that we have the right incentives, options and new social norms to make low-carbon transport easy to choose. Second, challenging institutional priorities that to date have not included a strong focus on low-carbon transition, we propose the following recommendations. Transport policymaking should be aligned with international sustainable mobility thinking that promotes an avoid, shift, improve framework for both passenger and freight transport. For the systemic change required, this would more clearly emphasise a hierarchy that focuses on reducing journeys in the first place through better land use planning, for example. Second, it aims to achieve modal shift, for instance to public transport, walking and cycling and passenger transport, and to rail and alternative last-mile delivery options in freight. Finally, the ASI framework focuses on improving vehicle efficiencies, for example through using alternative fuels, electrification or enhancing engine efficiencies. Government needs to provide low-carbon direction. This will signal a new pathway to investors, consumers and citizens. This includes leadership from the Department of Transport, Tourism and Sport, but should also be underpinned by a whole-of-government approach to climate action. The mandates of transport governance actors should be revised to include a statutory commitment to prioritise low-carbon development. More detailed carbon accounting and a heavier weight assigned to this could feature in project appraisals to inform decisions about transport investments. The public sector should lead by example. This could include not just central government, but also local authorities switching fleets to electrified alternatives. The civil service should give greater priority to low-carbon transition in their hiring, promotion and travel schemes. Third and finally, changing who shapes transport outcomes. Our research identifies a variety of institutional remedies that can help to advance the low-carbon transition. Focused task force could combine insights from public, private, academic and civil society actors around specific transport challenges. This could build upon the success of the Low Emission Vehicle Task Force that provided a structured forum and brought together key actors to unblock policy action for electric vehicle incentivisation. Multimodal transport hubs that connect transport options hold promise for decarbonising Irish passenger transport, along with enhanced redistribution hubs to decarbonise freight. Public-private partnerships may help to progress such low-carbon hubs, combining funding and expertise for change. Forums for peer learning can help villages, towns and cities across Ireland to learn from each other to scale up innovative low-carbon transport solutions. A variety of settlement sizes could learn from one another's experimental approaches while recognising important differences across the transport landscape. Deliberative forums for stakeholder and citizen participation could enhance transparency and moderate the impact of lobbying by special interests. Public information offices could be established, along with structured citizen assemblies for deliberation and engagement. Research infrastructure for transport policy that supports more diverse and inclusive transport research is needed, as well as channels of communication and absorptive capacity for more evidence-based policy making. This includes the potential for intermediary institutions for enhanced knowledge exchange between academia and government, and participatory backcasting approaches to create implementable transition frameworks. None of these solutions by themselves are a silver bullet, but together they can provide a governance framework that adequately addresses the climate crisis. We need to tackle Ireland's greenhouse gas emissions head-on. The recent declaration of a climate emergency by the Dáil made international headlines, but it will be meaningless if not backed up by concrete action. Transport would be a good place to start. Thank you.
Well, I thank you very much for your collective wisdom and knowledge and the papers you published some weeks ago. I asked that you come in when I saw your publication. I know that in parallel with your thinking, obviously the government have also issued a plan, and I suppose how you dovetail, both is the key, one of the key issues. The other point I think is that I like very much the principles that you're enunciating here. Also, it's up to the politicians and the parties and the public to put practical examples in place that will, that will be successful and will actually work. So what we do is we'll ask the members to comment or to ask questions, and I'll take Senator Feighan first, please.
I'm okay.
Deputy Troy.
Thank you very much, Chairperson, and indeed thanks to our witnesses for giving up their time today and coming in. I suppose, as someone quite rightly said, there has been a very in the last 6 months there has been a huge uptake in the interest by the general public and indeed by policy makers ourselves in terms of how we tackle climate change, and it's welcome and I think timely that you're here today, given that the government published their own climate action plan earlier this week. And transport, given that it's the second largest contributor to greenhouse gases, obviously has a key role to play in terms of how we do that. There seems to be a huge emphasis from government and from the government's plan in terms of transferring people from fossil fuel cars to electric vehicles. That seems to be one of their key points. And I suppose when you look at how, if you go back to say 2000 and the early 2010, I think there was a plan to have 200,000 electric vehicles by 2020. That plan was revised down in 2014 to 50,000, and in 2018 was revised further down to 20,000. So in terms of setting our plans, we have failed abysmally in terms of how we can achieve that. And as somebody who piloted an electric vehicle for 6 weeks in the run-up to the local election, I can see why people wouldn't make the transition. Our infrastructure is extremely poor. In terms of the number of charge points. I live in a village 9 miles outside Mullingar, no charge point there. Come to Mullingar, the provincial town of County Westmeath, population of 15,000 people, 6 public charge points and no high-speed charge point. So if we're talking about enabling people to make that transition, I think we've an awful long way to go in encouraging people and not to encourage them. I think there's a willingness there, but there's a practicality too in terms of can I actually do it? And I found myself after 6 weeks saying, could I survive on an electric vehicle? And the question would have to be at the moment, until the range is improved, no. And one of the points, I'm not sure who made it, but one of the points that they made is, while it's all very well and you welcome the fact that there's goals there, there's no timelines. The targets are set, but there's actually no timelines for implementation of when these targets are going to be achieved, or precise details. And if you look at the report on page 90, it says require new non-residential buildings with more than 10 parking spaces to have at least 1 recharging point installed by the 1st of January 2020. Like 1 charging point, so you put in a car park of 200 and 1 charging point by 2025. We really are, I don't think it's ambitious enough at all in terms of transferring over to electric vehicles. And I think from what you're saying in one of the presentations, electric vehicles should nearly be the last piece of the jigsaw, whereas with the government's policy it seems to be the first piece of the jigsaw. And going on what my colleague said earlier on in relation to public transport, while yes, it would be great to make public transport free, even if that was introduced in the morning, we have no capacity on so many of our routes. It's not integrated. Our ticketing system isn't even integrated. Never mind integrated in terms of people who are using it. So I think that is another issue. I suppose one of the other points I'd like to make is, and I think it was the last speaker, Dr. Devaney, who spoke about it, and it is the forums for peer learning, because despite the obvious uptake and the results of the last local and European election to demonstrate that there is a further acknowledgement and awareness out there that this is a real issue, there is still huge scepticism out there in terms of climate change, and there still is a huge reluctance in terms of how are we going to make the transition that it's not going to cost us. And I suppose the government sort of said that this can be done in a nudge way. I don't think it can. Like, there's going to be significant sacrifices that need to be made, and there's going to be, and that is going to cost. That's going to cost money. I suppose I'd be interested in to hear maybe your own views in terms of the government's climate action plan. Maybe I'm being unduly hard on it, and coming from the opposition benches, that's maybe natural, but I'd be interested to hear your own views on it. I'd be also interested to know, has the Department of Transport, Tourism and Sport, have they had any engagement with the National Economic and Social Council in relation to your research in terms of how they can extract your key findings and how they can implement it in their government policies? And given the fact that all the targets that we have set ourselves to date we have failed to achieve, how would you prioritise changes that need to be made? If you were the Minister for Transport in the morning and you had an opportunity to make 3 or 4 changes with immediate effect that, in your opinion, would give the greatest return in terms of reduction in carbon emissions, what would they be?
Okay, some very good questions there.
Can I start and then maybe pass to colleagues then, if that's okay? I just wanted to come on a very particular question. You're asking, had the Department of Transport been involved in any way, or have they been connected with the research? And Laura Bean from the Department was actually on the steering group for the research, so she was very supportive and very good input to the work as it went through. Obviously the work has just recently been published, so we haven't met with her since. So I just wanted to acknowledge that, because I think that was a key part of us commissioning the work, is that we wanted to have and it was a very short piece of research, so credit to colleagues here for getting under the skin of the transport sector the way that they did. But we wanted to both look at a process piece around institutional and governance, which is obviously something NESC is very interested in, with the very specific technical issues that I think colleagues here will be able to talk to. Just in relation to some of the things I'd like to say around the shift in the system that's needed, is putting the individual at the centre of the policy system and of the transport system. If we're trying to create a system of sustainable mobility, then we need to just think a bit more around not just the technical changes, as you've been talking about, the technical shift towards EVs, but also the social aspects need to be really at the heart of policy making and planning, and also that involves the digital transition as well as the wider issues of the opportunities that come from a low carbon transition. So I think that framing about starting to put the individual at the centre means that you start asking different questions, like, you know, as we've been thinking about how do you persuade people to perhaps not go to their car first of all, how can we make the infrastructure supportive of them cycling and walking? And at the moment that's kind of a risky thing to do in the city centre. So we just need to think about putting the individual at the heart of it, and then building out questions and supporting networks to understand how that might be developed. and I know colleagues might want to come up on some of those other things. I would welcome the Climate Action Plan. I think the significant steps towards thinking about the governance arrangements in there that we would have acknowledged and noted in our report. The Climate Action Delivery Board is something that we would have noted as being really important if you're going to try and deliver very concrete actions. And what our report would say that we would like a kind of action plan for jobs plus approach, as my colleague Larry was saying, and I think that we would like to see, as well as that kind of delivery mechanism that's in the Climate Action Plan, what kind of process is necessary to generate and tailor and generalise solutions. So what else can you do to try and get under some of the innovative bottom-up practices that colleagues here are talking about, and how you could feed that into the process. So I welcome that signal that we're taking governance very seriously, and it's about how you embed some of those solutions that I think maybe colleagues would like to pick up on.
Yeah. Thank you for your question. I nearly have another full opening statement written on my reaction to the Climate Action Plan, which I mightn't bore you with, but just to focus in on the transport chapter. First, I suppose, echoing Jean, I do welcome the Climate Action Plan. It's timely and necessary to have this political attention to it. Getting the top-down governance right, I think, has been key in the plan, and very welcome in terms of the direction, the carbon budgets, the emphasis on just transition, citizen engagement. There are really important elements there that they have got right. In terms of transport, and just to reiterate, I suppose this is coming from a personal reflection on it based on my experience in research across environmental governance. Our research for this didn't focus, obviously, on the Climate Action Plan. I would worry about the overemphasis on the I part of that ASI framework, so the avoid, shift, improve framework that we talk about in our research. The I is about improving efficiencies, and you're right, the overemphasis then on electric vehicles as solving all. There's a nod to the other aspects in terms of avoiding journeys by kind of work-for-home models and more compact growth. A little bit on the shift in terms of public transport and the establishment of a cycling office. But I think the predominant focus, unfortunately, is on EVs, and I wouldn't agree with that from a progress point of view, I suppose, or a transformative perspective. EVs are part of the solution, I think, and they will be important in rural areas that don't have access to public transport or that can't cycle into certain places. And that sprawl settlement, they will have a low carbon benefit there, only if the energy source is decarbonised as well. I'd like to caveat that. But if we move from a low carbon framing and we think about a sustainability framing for sustainable mobility, EVs do have contradictions in terms of they don't address issues of congestion, for example. They don't address the costs associated with that, the stress, the health implications. They don't reduce accidents. They don't promote active transport. And there's social sustainability concerns even in terms of the sourcing of materials for EVs as well. We mentioned that in our report. Increasing cases of child labour, for example, in the Congo, sourcing cobalt for the batteries for these EVs due to that increasing demand. So I think there's a very careful, life cycle analysis part to understanding EVs too. And I think that would be my reflection of the wider focus of the transport chapter. I'd have similar questions, I suppose, around the focus on CNG, even for freight, as the only option. Not forgetting, compressed natural gas, it is a fossil fuel. So I'd be worried about lock-in into another fossil fuel for that. Also, there's research in Europe that has shown that, okay, there might be carbon savings from CNG, but there's potential for methane leakage, which is a much more potent greenhouse gas emission. So the emissions benefit there mightn't actually be what we think it would be. Same with biofuels. Will I continue? There's similar conflicts with biofuels in terms of sourcing. Conflicts for food and feed. The sustainable production of that virgin material is essential. Or if we're talking about using, used cooking oil or waste, are we importing that from abroad, and what's the emissions profile with that? Are we actually achieving the objectives we want by this plan? The neglect of aviation was something that struck me. Obviously, it's part of a different regulatory scheme. It's not part of, it can be part of the emissions trading scheme. There's other international regulations around that. But I think it's remiss to ignore aviation, particularly as we're talking about establishing Waterford Airport now and reinvesting in that, or potentially talking about a third terminal for Dublin Airport. And there's no discussion in those conversations about the environmental impact of those infrastructure decisions. So I think for more cohesive, transformative policy making, we do need to consider aviation within this climate action plan as well. That is, I suppose, in a nutshell, it's that there's been too much focus on that technology solving all, EV solving all, CNG solving all, not that much on public transport. That's tangible, or as Deputy Coppinger said there, in terms of even free public transport, there's options there. There was a note at one point to the sharing economy, but no progress on that in terms of developing, for example, sharing schemes for bicycles, for electric scooters, for sharing cars, which would have a much more positive, sustainable impact in terms of emissions, but also in terms of that social aspect that we really need as well. I would see an over-reliance on tax to change behaviour, and from my experience working in sustainable consumption fields, there's a critique of tax as the motivation for behaviour change, that you need to adopt, as Jean referred to and our report refers to, a more cohesive social practice approach. And as Deputy Troy said there, that you're looking at the charging network and the incentives to get electric vehicles, and that's timely. But then you're also looking at the education, information, awareness, promotion around this, the positive incentives that you could have, get away from the punitive measures. So I think, again, stressing, I know this is just a plan, and I know the Climate Action Plan, the next step is to implement it and create policy, but I think it's really important to get that plan right in the first place, and a greater focus on avoiding journeys in the first place and shifting to public transport options and alternatives for freight outside of CNG would be essential.
Okay, sorry.
The last question I asked, I suppose, if each of you were Minister for Transport in the morning, what three things would you change, if you could, with immediate effect?
Thinking here now,
Deputy Troy, thank you very much for the questions, and I can't hope to match my colleagues' forensic analysis of the Climate Action Plan. But I think my response to your final question very much builds on what Laura was saying, and the overemphasis in the transport chapter on technological improvement. That said, I think that we need to recognise, and this comes through in our report, that transport systems vary across space. There are very different challenges in different parts of the country. So I think there is a place for electric vehicle rollout, and one of the key constraints there, I think, is the charging infrastructure. The costs are coming down very significantly. It's referenced in the Climate Action Plan that Bloomberg New Energy Finance, who've crunched the numbers on this, project that by 2022 electric vehicles for private transport will be cheaper on a total cost of ownership basis than internal combustion engines. So that's if you take both the purchase cost and the running cost over the lifetime of the vehicle. By 2022, just 3 years from now, electric vehicles will be cheaper on that basis. So they'll become the obvious choice, but not if the charging infrastructure isn't there. So I think that's one thing that we really need to focus on and prioritise. And then a second, and picking up on Laura's emphasis on the avoid and the shift piece, I think we need to really prioritise public transport in a way that we don't see coming through strong enough in the Climate Action Plan. So more funding for public transport and more funding for cycling and walking infrastructure. We were just remarking when we were waiting to come in here this morning about even things as simple as traffic light sequences. They seem, cyclists and pedestrians seem to be an afterthought in the way that we design our public spaces and allocate space to different modes of transport. So I would place a priority on that, and as Laura said, I don't think that comes through strongly enough in the transport chapter in the Climate Action Plan as it was published on Monday.
Sure, go ahead. Yeah.
Could I
Sorry, Senator Feighan then. Sorry, excuse me. Go ahead. Yeah. You finish your
Okay,
contribution.
thank you. I just wanted to pick up on that. I think I was struck by an example from Vienna where they designed the city on the basis of could a child navigate the city. And when you think about something like that, you start thinking about putting pedestrian at the heart of city public transport planning. So I cycle and, nearly collided with a bus this morning. So, I think it's about thinking about putting that kind of design into it. And then on the Forum for Peer Learning, you're talking about how some communities are struggling to really engage with, how they might, because I think there is a lot of motivation to change, and people recognise how serious the situation is, climate action, but it's about that peer-to-peer learning. And I'm very struck by the sustainable energy communities as an example and a model where you have communities who are coming up with energy solutions, renewable energy plannings themselves, and then they're talking to other communities about how they did it and the learning from that. And I think something similar around local transport-based solutions, thinking about the public participatory networks at a local level. There's lots of infrastructure there at a community level with the National Dialogue on Climate Action that could then help people to become those bottom-up solutions that then the policy system would have a mechanism for learning from and rolling out those which are working. So that would be the one thing I would change, would be to resource some of those bottom-up solutions and put the mechanism for learning and picking up of what works. Over you.
Thank you. Sorry, Senator Feighan.
Yeah, I like your views regarding the Forum for Peer Learnings for villages and towns and cities. I think we've been quite lazy. Certainly local authorities, I believe, have been quite lazy. I know that we went and got funding for a cycle path many years ago, and the local authorities put in footpaths. And, I think now that there's much more stricter conditions, but, I'm just looking at the fact is we're talking about cities, and it's great to see so many cyclists, but I think in rural areas, and especially where I live, North Roscommon, South Leitrim, you have Carrick-on-Shannon, which is the centre town. It would only take 45-50 minutes with good rain there to cycle between Boyle and Carrick or vice versa. I think a lot more can be done, like the model in Germany or in Belgium or Holland, that people will be able to cycle between little villages, and it's still not there. I know there's a lot of stuff happening, but it's still not there. But I think your idea regarding towns and villages to come up with ideas to help the environment or effectively, I think it's a great idea. It's a great incentive, and maybe if there's something that maybe those villages and towns could save money or get if they come up with an idea, and they can learn from one another. But I think we're on the cusp of something actually great in some ways. But as I said, I saw the approach of most local authorities to use the funding for cycleways to effectively build their own infrastructure, which was, for me, was wrong. But I think there's a much better way. And just finally, we all want to use public transport. Let's say public transport in the morning. There's a squeezed middle out there. I don't have free transport, but there is a squeezed middle out there. And if, let's say, in public transport, if I live in Dublin, I have my Leap car and I take the bus in and things like that, that's great. It's a good value. But you don't use the train as often. You don't use the buses as often. If there was a kind of an incentive, let's say you charge a £5 for every train journey, what would that cost from a taxpayer point of view? Are you talking about billions or millions or something like that? Is it done in any other country that you have an incentive? And the trains aren't so bad in Ireland compared to the UK. It's not so bad. But is there any incentive that could be used for the middle ground, people who don't have year-round, to get us off the roads?
Okay.
Thanks. I'll just come back on that question, and also maybe to reference the Deputy Coppinger's project on free public transport. I mean, just specifically on it was very interesting at the recent EPA conference. There was a speaker there from the mayor of Austria, or Vienna was there, and they had introduced, not quite free transport, but they had introduced a pass essentially, which was, I think it was about €300 for the year, would cover all of your public transport needs during the year. And on your question of the costing of it, I mean, you'd have to look at it, but it almost paid for itself. So there was a big subvention provided by government, but actually the take-up was so huge at the low level. So it was quite interesting when you provided sort of an entry point. But just to take up on it, I mean, I think it's very interesting when you talk about a project. I mean, the essential issue in the NESC view is that it's some of the issues around how we get to decarbonise transport are going to be complex. What we need to then do is then get into projects and get really into the detail of how they work. So I'm very interested in the public transport one. I mean, part of it is, as you've been discussing it earlier, are there international examples? And that'll get you so far. But actually, then it becomes complex in your own area. So the minute you start talking about free public transport, well, presumably then you mean a lot more of it. So now you're into issues about, well, are you going to more bus lanes? And we know then you're into issues about the complexities in communities and how they'll react to it. You're into all sorts of, the risk. You mentioned about ticketing, all that has to be resolved. There's issues around safety. You've now got a lot more people taking public transport, walking down when they're in a city. My view is that that's not an argument to say, well, you wouldn't do it, okay? But it is an argument to say, well, it's beyond transport in a sense. I mean, it requires, it's, as you said, an exchequer cost. It requires issues around planning. It requires issues around community engagement. But the NESC view of it is that if you're serious about climate, they're exactly the kind of projects you've got to take on and do serious analysis around. And particularly even, I would say it's a project that would be of interest to NESC in terms of, I think it has that type of complexity and it has the kind of ambition that I think is the kind of issue that you need to get involved in. And to take the connections that Jean was making, I mean, that project also depends on community engagement and process of collaboration. And I think recently we came across a project in Inchicore where the residents are putting forward a contraflow system, so that might allow you to do public transport without, you'd have the lanes and different times would be going different ways. But that's what you want. You want somebody in the community coming forward with the solution. And that's the type, then you need to get into, well, what types of process do you need to create within local communities to get that out onto the table early? So when NESC talks about the projects being complex, we're not saying that in the sense of we're standing back from it, saying, I think it's then how do you delve in. So I'm very interested in the idea that you take on maybe a day or two session to talk about public transport in the way you're framing it, and I would say that it's something NESC would be interested in.
Which leads to Deputy Coppinger.
Yeah. First of all, I realise that I'm glad to hear you're making the comment about free public transport, that you would be open to putting forward that idea. I realise, obviously, academics or NGO, it's limited what they can argue for, right? And I think what you're arguing for is on the more conservative side of things, if you compare it to what other cities have done in terms of like free public transport. So I'm glad that you're open to it. I think the crisis that we have is not an ordinary crisis. I mean, everyone knows, I'm sure, the Greta Thunberg quote that's become legendary of "act like your house is on fire." And governments, I certainly think that what the government has put out has pushed them a bit further than they would have gone a year or two ago. I think we can give thanks to the young people who've taken to the streets, the fright that a lot of people got in the elections. But I think that we don't even just need radical, we need revolutionary changes globally to tackle climate change, if you're talking about within 10 to 12 years. So I think our governments are still standing with their arms folded. I mean, my ideological view would be that as long as the entire economy and transport is in private hands, it's extremely difficult to make the changes that are necessary anyway. But just in terms of transport, it's good that we will be having a session, but just about 100 cities now. There was a special conference on free public transport early last year, and at that point there was about 100 cities, but now it's increased, and Luxembourg. And initially the idea was treated as absurd. But actually, as has been mentioned there, if you look at, there would have to be massive investment. I mean, what the Taoiseach said about we don't have the capacity, he was asked this by the Journal yesterday, as was Minister Ross. Now, Minister Ross I think, poo-pooed the idea even more because he's so committed to private transport anyway, it would seem to me. But Deputy Varadkar made the point, and we represent the same constituency, that he comes from a commuter belt and he'd be very worried about the impact straight away if you had that. Like, nobody's saying straight away, you know. Most countries do this with a year of an announcement. Straight away you could increase the bus fleet quite quickly, but you'd have to look at light rail systems. I'm going to do a bit of research on how quickly, certainly in this country they're not built very quickly, but in other countries I've seen reports of 2 years actually. But if you really consider this an emergency, that's what has to happen. In terms of some of the benefits of having made an investment into public transport, there was reduced road traffic accidents in all these cities. There was cleaner air, there was less noise, there was faster emergency response times, which saved money as well. There was the abolition of ticket infrastructure. Do you remember we used to have the tolls on the M50? I used to go over that every day. That used to add about half an hour to your journey. You know, so there's an infrastructure saving as well. But also older people. Now I know we have, at limited times, we do have free travel passes, but what happened was more people started using public transport, which enhanced commerce in cities. So actually businesses started to make more money than they were. Because I know, for example, if you're in parts of like Clonea or Mulhuddard, you're marooned, you're isolated, you can't get into the city. I remember when I was teaching in West Halla, bringing some of the school students into the city centre was like a different universe for some of them because they didn't spend very much time there, you know. So I think we've had such an ongoing neoliberal concept where everything must be paid for, but actually in the past loads of countries had free public transport, which is probably why countries like Poland have loads of cities where free public transport. China in many of its cities introduces it as well. Tallinn in Estonia, also passenger numbers increased 8-fold very quickly when they introduced free public transport. They also had a tourist boom because people were coming to the city enjoying being able to get around. So yes, there will be initial investment which would require progressive taxation on wealth to pay for free public transport. It can't come just from ordinary workers and working class people all the time, which is the default method of this government. It has to come from huge increases in taxation. Dublin's now the slowest city in Europe, and we really have to look at this.
I'd make my own comment on some of those points. Would you like to respond to any members of the...
Well, I mean, I suppose just to... I mean, I suppose we agree with the... But I'm interested in the project, and I suppose all I'm pointing out is that part of the NESC approach, something like that, would be maybe to try to help to probe some of the complexities, because I think there are complexities when you try to figure some of these out. So that, and just to mention a second piece, in terms of the climate action plan, there's a clear recommendation in there that NESC would have a role in trying to monitor the just transition as the climate plan is implemented, and we're very, very interested in that work. And particularly at the moment, one of the big challenges is how do you really identify who's the most vulnerable and impacted by the transition. So one of the areas that comes up in that context is transport. So when you model it, the high level transport sector comes out from the ESRI analysis. So it's more just for information. One of the pieces of work that we're doing at the moment, proposing to, is a piece of qualitative research in the transport sector to look at some of the workers that would be most vulnerable to the low carbon transition. So that's something maybe we can do.
People who drive freight, they're hugely impacted. I think part of the issue for me is actually selling the message, selling the policy, and making sure that the economic impact of the changes on people in their workplace is reduced as much as possible, or that the changes they have to make are assisted and supported, so that the economy doesn't suffer, but the work is still done. It's not the reality. That's what we've got to get to. And the other point is, and it's a separate point, but what concerns me is that I'm all for. I have no issue with these policies, but the problem is when you put energy infrastructure, in a rural community, renewable energy infrastructure, there's absolute war, and you have thousands of people objecting and all sorts of hassle over it. So there's a huge message that has to be sold, and there must be seen to be a benefit to the communities through which this infrastructure passes through. There must be a real economic benefit to them, because they are paying the price, for the energy going from A to B. And it does affect their quality of life. So I think they're the sort of issues we need to address in a bigger picture. Sorry,
Deputy, can I just thank you for that comment around wind engagement, wind energy and community engagement was a piece of work we did 2014, and we found that very much that if you involve communities and you give them I suppose a share either in the sort of the economics of it or the social impacts of renewable energy, that they are much more open to it. And so it's it's a justice issue as well, about both the procedural justice, about it being a fair and transparent system, but also distributive justice in the sense that they're having something back. And I think that's a broader issue around looking at the sort of decarbonisation of the Irish economy, that it isn't just taking emissions out, it's got to be creating a new, I suppose, social vision of what kind of society we want. So there's a social aspect to that, and that's why when you think now about renewable energy, you can't forget about the fact that you need to bring people along with you, and you need to think about community engagement. So I don't think we'd make that mistake now, knowing as much as we do now about social, but it would be nice to think that every technical challenge that we think about in terms of decarbonisation, that we also think about what are the social aspects of this, how can we involve and engage. But
just on that point, you're talking about, I think 20% comes from renewable energy. I think the target is to be 70 in a number of years. So part of that needs you guys or somebody to find the best way of getting communities to accept that change, and to make it, as you say, that there is justice in their literally in their lives, that they benefit independently and separately from this coming through their community, as opposed to getting nothing and just put up with it from their perspective. I think. Sorry. Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. No, I completely agree with those comments, and I think it's even beyond getting people to accept the change, but it's having them involved from the get-go as part of this, buzzword of co-designing the solutions to it. We've had these discussions within NESC and DCU. There can often be accusations of NIMBYism, of people rejecting wind farms, and it's not in my backyard. But it's often not NIMBYism, as we've discussed, that it's because they weren't engaged from the get-go. Rather, they were just produced the final plan and asked to accept it.
But so that's why we do issue for Dublin, as a committee, we support the project, say, like Bus Connect. Nothing makes more sense than getting people twice the speed to their place of work and home twice as quickly. But the problem is that the community, they are being consulted, but we need to, striking the balance between, do you take the trees or you take out the cars? And that's the question, isn't it? For some communities, or do you find alternative routes? Going one way in the morning and coming somewhere in the afternoon, or it's finding imaginative solutions to the problem, and that's the sort of thinking we need to do. Because and I think, the benefit, sorry, excuse me.
No, I do think it's from the bottom up, and as the Senator was saying there, that it is to include, especially from a rural solution, they know what their landscape is. He knows how long it takes to cycle to boil. They're the kind of ideas and bottom-up approaches that we really are advocating for in our recommendations, to have those structured inclusions.
Sorry,
thank you, Chair. A couple of comments. First of all, picking up on this discussion, I think this is one of the weaknesses or lost opportunities in the Climate Action Plan. The strength, picking up on what Jean said earlier, is the governance structure. So it's really good at putting in place a robust reporting and accountability framework. The plan is to be updated annually, reported on quarterly. There's an implementation board in the Department of the Taoiseach, beefed up Climate Action Committee and our Council, and all of those are very good in terms of the top-down piece. But where I think there's a missed opportunity in the report is in terms of this whole bottom-up infrastructure, and in other ways as well. If you compare the Climate Action Plan with the Oireachtas Committee report, there was a chapter on communications and education, and that's almost a footnote in the Climate Action Plan. So in various ways, I think the Climate Action Plan if you like, replicates our traditional approaches to policy making in Ireland, which is a shame, but it's a good start and something to build on. But if I can have 30 seconds more, I wanted to come back to Deputy Coppinger's question where we all began around free public transport. I think it's a really promising idea, either completely free or, as Larry was saying, I was at the EPA conference as well, where the Mayor of Vienna talked about, I think it was €365. So it was a euro a day. So not completely free, but certainly much cheaper than public transport is here in Ireland. And I think that's really worth considering, and I'm glad to hear that you'll be discussing that in the future. I would raise one note of caution, which is around and picking up again on the point around justice. It's about the urban-rural dimension to this. So often in climate policy debates we hear complaints from rural communities saying it's all very well for you up in Dublin to raise the carbon tax because you have the choice of cycling or walking or taking public transport. And my fear with the proposal for free public transport is that it benefits certain parts of the country much more clearly than it benefits other parts of the country. And that's not an argument for not doing it, but it is an argument for taking really seriously these questions around justice and how we manage those.
Can I just say on that very briefly? I mean, free public transport should be free everywhere. So the idea that it would just apply to certain cities, because I've heard that people kind of react like that, but I think you would decide that public transport's going to be free. Either way, there has to be a massive enhancement of it. And just this thing about people have a choice of cycling. Not everybody can cycle to work, unfortunately. It's just if you live 14 miles out and you just don't have the physical capacity or whatever, you know. So it isn't a question of choice. And also the carbon tax that I'm hearing will be on your ESB bill. And it will be, I don't think, and it will be, yes, on your bag of coal or bag of logs. But it will apply. It applies on everyone right now, rural or urban, and even the choices you make don't necessarily free you from it.
Deputy Murphy, and then obviously Deputy Ryan.
And apologies, I was longer there was a row and a suspension and another row.
Who won?
Anyway, it's the joys of trying to be in two places at once. In relation to, I suppose many of us who've been around the transport issue for a long time want to see action. Some of us have seen very good plans in the past, and we went into that in a very enthusiastic way, in a very deliberative forum. For example, when the Dublin Transportation Initiative was rolled out in the early 1990s, both myself and Deputy Ryan would have been on a consultative panel, an advisory panel, and we put great time and energy into what I think had some very good things when it came out. And my view on plans now is predicated on that enthusiasm and what happened. There was a degree of where people lived and the scenario testing of, and we got the worst case scenario. We were going to have higher densities in the city centre. We were going to have, we were going to have linkages with public transport, and the investment was going to be aligned with the best case scenario. And of course, that isn't what happened, and we're now trying to retrofit some of the mistakes of not doing things in the way that it was hoped to design them. I'm only looking at obviously one location. You're looking at places like Galway that is absolutely choked with traffic, and what has been suggested as the solution. You're looking at Cork, and you're looking at Limerick, because we have a very dispersed population pattern in the more rural areas. That's more difficult to deal with from a public transport perspective. So I'm looking at the plans that have been provided. And I want them to work, and I think they not only want them to work, but we need them to work. I know the next generation. I know their names because I can see them. some of them are my grandchildren, and you know the kind of fallout that they're going to have to pick up if we don't do our job today. But I have a very big sinking feeling in relation to the government's climate plan, because I'm looking at just exactly what is, from a transport perspective, what is being proposed. There's no proposal to review the National Development Plan. We've declared a climate emergency. We don't dispute the science, but we don't see any shift towards funding public transport over and above the roads projects, which are more heavily funded in the plan than public transport. I have been going on about Dart Underground or the interconnector for 20 years now, but I don't see how you can solve Dublin's transport problems without delivering on big projects like Dart Underground, which was part of the Dublin Transportation Initiative. And it's interesting that the reason why the European funding was sought, because the European funding was delivered in different ways, but there was a shift in the early 1990s towards you having to make an argument for why funding should happen. And Dublin made an argument, and when I talk about Dublin, I'm talking about the outer counties as well, because there's a focus towards the city. The reason the argument was made was because Dublin had become uncompetitive because of traffic congestion. We're now at a point, as Deputy Coppinger made, we're now one of the slowest cities in Europe. And I'm struggling to see the coherence in the government's plan from a transport perspective. If it's predominantly about building roads and shifting people from diesel and petrol cars into electric cars or hybrid cars or whatever, you've got to produce the electricity to start with. And we've seen a programme only in the last couple of weeks in relation to money points. So there's a big issue here in relation to capacity and in relation to making that shift as well. But there's also a vision about, we're still going to have the traffic jams unless we put the public transport in place. We're still going to have the traffic jams. It's just still going to be cleaner traffic jams. That's my feeling of how this plays out. Because unless we put that investment into big ticket items, big public transport projects, we're not going to make the kind of sizable shift until we really address where people are going to live and where they work. We're going to be constantly trying to retrofit. I've got to say, I would like this government plan interrogated, because it's almost like, the opposition will always, will be critical. But I think there's very good reason to be critical of this plan. And I want to see that criticism coming from the political sources as heavily as it needs to be criticised, because we have to make this work. And I honestly don't see in this plan how we're going to get that shift unless we take those quite dramatic steps of putting our money where our mouth is. Putting our money where our mouth is putting money into public transport. I don't see any other way of doing it. I think there's a degree of what you can do with electric cars, but I think there is no escaping the big item that needs to get the kind of attention, and that for me is a shift in how we fund public transport.
On that point, and I am the chairman, I'm conscious I'm the chairman of this committee as opposed to just an individual. I think that we have the opportunity as a committee to invite in the Minister to interrogate the 2040 plan. That's a choice we can make. And it seems to me one of the things we should do, and I'm just looking at some of your, on page 2 of your recommendations, that the public sector should lead by example, that maybe a constructive engagement we could have is to write to all of the bodies which are affiliates or who report directly or indirectly to the Department of Transport, the state and the semi-state bodies, to ask them by say whatever date we decide to give us their plans for change, particularly in their transport activities. And the other point you make about local authorities, I think even it's broader than just local authorities. Like it's the on-posts, it's everybody really that gets a penny of taxpayers' money. They should be accountable in terms of their plans. And I think that'll be a constructive thing to do.
And how people are going to do things.
No, I understand that.
How they're going to do it, where the money is.
Yeah, no. Yeah, that's what I said. But the other point I want to make is that I do think, notwithstanding your point of view, is that that the DART expansion is hugely important. The Metrolink is hugely important.
Cycling.
Bus Connect is hugely important. The strategic park and rides are all important. So it isn't correct to say that there's not huge investment in public transport coming, and very welcome. And but I'm happy to take everybody's point of view. But what we need to do as a committee is to make people accountable to us, like the Minister, like the transport companies, to get those policy shifts or changes. And I think that your contribution today is very helpful in that. And the other point I'd like to make is that to go back to the farmers and to go back to the freight operators, because that's where the pushback is going to come, obviously, because their costs are going to go up. Their product won't be as easy to sell abroad because it's going to be more expensive as things stand. So we need to have a benefit economically to them for this change, either by supporting the physical transport infrastructure or by taxation measures. You talk about tax policy, but it can also be constructive to bring about change. I don't know if you have any views on that, because I think that's a huge part of the argument. And the part of the question I have is, of the 20% of CO2 that comes from transport, how does that break down between the different, say, farming, or can you break that down into the origin of the CO2 emissions? Is there not a graph or a pie chart which we could look at that gives us? You talked about the people who will be most affected are obviously those who are going to be most economically affected. Isn't that it? Isn't that the truth of it? And our economy will be affected if we don't do it right. So I think we can to put all that together.
Yeah. Well,
sorry.
I mean, just a few points. I mean, I think absolutely the just transition piece we're interested in doing is trying to just do that and look at some of the workers. I mean, Diarmaid might talk about just some of the numbers, because I know he's been doing some work on the transport. And just to take Deputy Murphy's comment, I think it's an interesting one that the interrogation of the plan would be beyond the political system. I think while we wouldn't be in a position personally to comment on the plan, I think it's interesting to think about that invitation for NESC to maybe look at an interrogation of the plan, and we would certainly consider the idea that the officials in the department working the plan might come to NESC, so that the members there, and as I said at the start, we've quite a diverse range of organisations on it, and I think that is an important conversation that NESC should contribute to have an interrogation of the plan with a view to commenting at a point. So.
Well, I've just been looking back at these are figures from the Department of Transport. So emissions from the transport sector break down at 76% is road transport, then 17% is aviation, and 5% is maritime. And then within that road transport sector, 52% is private car use, 26% is goods vehicles, is what I can find at the moment, but I can go back to you with.
Afterwards, can you send us on?
Absolutely, yeah.
That's very helpful now, because it shows where we've got to do the thinking, doesn't it? Yeah.
The aviation is, we're picking up aviation because of the ownership, the location. It's not all. I mean, I think we were looking at this, the Public Accounts Committee there not so long ago, and it's because the like Ryanair is headquartered here.
Is that planes that their origin is Ireland, regardless of where they go, the CO2 come back to us? Is that it? No, is that what you're saying? I mean, I don't...
Is it where the company is based? Or I thought it was where the flight originates.
No,
is
we
it?
were told where the company was based.
Okay.
And so I think that will be one I think that needs to be looked at, because, I mean, we have a lot of. I mean, the headquarters here is important from that point of view, in terms of
fact of what it is. Sorry, Deputy Ryan. Sorry, excuse me. Yeah, sorry, go ahead. Yeah.
Just picking up on a couple of points. Chair, you mentioned public bodies. One of the aspects of the Climate Action Plan that I think is very welcome is, towards the end of the report, there's a chapter on the public sector leading by example, and within that there's provision for all public bodies to have mandates, low carbon or climate change mandates added, and reporting around that, which is very welcome, and it's something that we highlighted in our report. But there is a risk that would turn into a greenwashing exercise. So public sector bodies, and I have none in particular in mind, but they could see it as a tick box exercise, and I think the way to counter that is by scrutiny, and one way to do that is parliamentary scrutiny, and the Climate Action Committee is to be set up as a standing committee under the Climate Action Plan. But I think that accountability, that parliamentary accountability, would be strengthened if other Oireachtas committees would do likewise. So that transport bodies would not just be having to account to the Climate Action Committee on the low carbon mandate, but that the Oireachtas Transport Committee would do likewise. So I think there's an important role for your committee.
No, I just wanted to pick up on a point, Chair, that you said around, I think the storytelling around this is very important too, and the framing of this that you mentioned, the increased costs for freight. There's actually huge cost savings that can be associated with many of the initiatives and solutions that we'd put in place. Simple things like mandatory eco-driving reduces, fuel costs as well as emissions, as well as these other co-benefits, but that there are savings there. So I think, I really welcome that inclusion of the freight sector and inclusion of those actors. I think we're all in it together, as I think Tara Shine referred to it as collaborative humans. Let's stop talking about detached stakeholders. That's why we advocate this governance approach that would include these sectors in the decision making and in the solutions. Just to pick up on a point in terms of the funding of big projects that Deputy Murphy referred to, and obviously essential kind of public transport investment. And perhaps this is something that the parliamentary process, if public sector bodies are held accountable as well, is to move us beyond short-term planning, that these one-off projects, that they're connected in the transport landscape, that it's not just looking at the bus in isolation and then the metro in isolation. And I think that was something that emerged quite strongly in our research from within the sector, that people felt from working in transport, it's planning on the hoof. We developed the Lewis and didn't, it was two separate lines. Why was that not connected? And then we'll rejig that again and disrupt it to get the metro in. So I think there needs to be something that takes us beyond the short-term political cycles and this longer-term vision, and it's part of the transformative change. I think that Deputy Coppinger referred to there, that it is more embedded in the system for sustained climate action, and that it's a long-term focus for these big projects, not just in isolation.
I'd have to bring in Deputy Ryan after Gianni, just to make one
Just on that point, colleagues, they'd be very cross we didn't mention they're doing work on transport-oriented development, and I know they'd be keen to come in and talk to you about that, as sort of linking land use planning of these big projects and transport. And we know that the sort of planning system tends to be centred on cars, but there are other cities and other places in the world where essentially you maximise the number of homes, jobs, services, amenities which are close to frequent high-quality transport services. So you plan them together where people live and work next to transport, and clearly then the state can use the uplift in the land value to invest in affordable housing and other schemes. So it's about thinking longer term about how you link both the transport and the urban fabric, I suppose, together. And that's something colleagues are working on, and as I say, they'd be happy to talk to.
Just that last point there is that maybe one of the things should be in the planning sphere that it should be we should look at mandatory requirements, additional, in terms of planning estates or planning whatever it is, that there'd have to be a carbon-proofed analysis or some sort of document that would have to be would articulate in a scientific or in an actual way rather than aspirational, you know, how it will impact or how it will change, you know, CO2 emissions or how it will impact in that area. I think that might make sense as well. As opposed to the aspiration.
We did the report on that, and our but our next step is exactly on your question. So the idea is good, and you can see it internationally. So we have an event next Friday with key experts, stakeholders in the area to try to probe that out. Well, what would it look like if it was to be done in practice? So,
very good.
So maybe after that we could come back to the committee.
Right. Sorry, Deputy Ryan.
Yeah, I was very glad that Deputy Murphy raised that past of our common role on the Dublin Transportation Advisory Committee. We are the poster children of the touchy-feely, bottom-up, civil engagement-y, NGO contributory way that you're advocating. And it was brilliant. It was absolutely brilliant because it educated you, and you in turn educated the system, and it led to better debate and better analysis, and it really worked. It really does work. So when you're advocating all that touchy-feely, bottom-up engagement stuff, I'm agreed, 100%. I was slightly disheartened, I'd have to admit, at the end of that decade, in the late 90s, we wrote a very good Platform for Change plan, and we were involved in it. And I will always remember the closing part of that. It was very well done, good modelling, good people, good engineers, our best. And the closing period in that time was, there was a presentation done in a committee to us as the advisory committee. I don't know if you remember, Catherine, this, but it said, whatever you do, build the metro first and build the Dart interconnector. Don't widen the M50 first. Don't build investment roads. Whatever you do, that's what we have to do. Yeah, okay, we're going to do it now. We kept saying to my wife, we'd go home, Dublin's about to change. We're going to be a cycling city. We went off to Utrecht for weeks, came back with all the stuff. We've done this for 25 years. We know what to do now. And what did we do? We widened the M50. We put off the metro. We did nothing on cycling. We did nothing on buses for the last 15, 20 years, in truth. I didn't give up. We kept going, gone to government, wrote a sustainable transport plan. Thought, OK, let's make the DTO model bigger. Let's do it all over the country. It's not the NTA. What happened? We're out of government. The sustainable transport plan was thrown away. All those models of what we need to do for the last 8 years, nothing has happened. The NTA was engaged. There was a takeover by the National Roads Authority of the NTA is what happened. So we've had a roads-based transport system for the last 10 years under that structure. I still didn't give up hope. I saw the National Planning Framework recently, which was again saying the same thing we've been saying for 30 years. We've got to go back into the centre, we've got to go back to the core. I thought maybe there's still hope yet. Still saying to my wife when I got home at night, it's about to change, we're going to go to sustainable transport. What happened? The National Development Plan abandoned it. It's all roads, as ever. It says 50% of the new housing is going to be outside existing urban areas. How do you square that with the National Planning Framework? It's IBEC running. Why is this? Because we make money out of roads. We know how to make money out of making roads. We have a big industrial base now that knows, in my mind, how to make money out of roads. Even if they don't make any transport sense, they make good economic sense because people are good at making money out of making roads, in my mind. I'm sorry if that's cynical, but I'm letting out 30 years of frustration in this space. It's also politics. Politics trumps everything. You can do all your bottom-up touchy-feely, top-down politics counts. And the truth is that 75% of all our trips in the car, in the country it's 80%. Public transport accounts for 5% of trips. National Transport Household Survey. And politicians aren't stupid. The advertising agency spends millions to our people telling us the promise, if only we've another little bit of road, we'll finally be free. And because politicians represent that, 80% are very sensitive to them, that's what we do. Still on that false promise. And the other reason, the third reason why it doesn't happen is because it's difficult. The other stuff is why you need the bottom-up touchy-feely stuff is because it's reallocating space
And it's difficult to reallocate space where 75% of everyone is in the car, and you want to get that back. And it's not just, it's the parking as well as the trucks, and winning back space for the child, or for the cyclist, or for the old person, or for the blind person, or for anyone who isn't in that big industrial, making money out of cars, roads-based system does not count. And the framing, Laurie, you're absolutely right. Watching again television last night, it's the same old framing. Michael Healy-Rae with the flak cap on, have a great time for Michael, but I don't know about this. And what about the poor people, the poor farmers? What about this? What about the 200,000 people who commute more than 2 hours a day, which is injurious to their health? 80,000 of them have young children. What about the families that they don't see their parents? What about the 80% of Irish children who do not get the recommended level of daily exercise because of this system that we've created? Are we ever going to take that into account on a prime-time show and the framing of this debate? No. And then I hope was raised again the Climate Action Plan, because we really got the hairs on this time. We had Department of Transport officials in here. It was excruciating how bad they were. What their ambitions be in 2030, we don't know. The TII came in and were asked in this committee, Chair, I'll never forget it, what's your solution to gridlock in Dublin? They wrote it down in their paper. They wrote it down to say our solution to transport to gridlock in Dublin is to widen the N7 between Naas and Newbridge, to widen the N6, to widen the N3, to widen the N2, to widen the N11. That was their answer to the question of how do you improve transport in Dublin. And then we get the Climate Action Plan, and there's brilliant stuff in it around the governance. You're right around, OK, how we're going to start this action plan's approach, everything's right. But the transport section is a disgrace, is an utter disgrace. And Catherine Murphy, you're absolutely right. It needs other people to start saying that. Because my analysis, point me where I'm wrong. To be honest, the reliance on a McKinsey-Mac curve is so early 2000s in climate change policy, it's embarrassing. The kind of promise of a cycling office is so 1990s, and we've had that and heard that for so often, I'm tired of it. The promise of a scrappage scheme that hasn't even been worked out is so SIMI, and just so ill-thought and inappropriate. Just doubling electric vehicles on some back of a McKinsey-Mac curve is just not good enough, given that we've spent 2 years of this. The whole Transport Department is, in my mind, in shame, and that's the best that they can come up with.
Can I just say, I'm not interrupting your flow of thought at all, but we would welcome your presence here at our meetings to make those points. And when you're entitled to all your views, we've had all of those bodies in there, and we'd be very happy if you came when they do come in.
I would love to. I'd answer Robert Troy's question. I'll just finish my train of thought if I can.
No, hold on a second. I'm happy. My job is to share this meeting, and you're very welcome here. What I'm really saying to you is we welcome you here more often, because we have a real good benefit of the people that you're talking about will hear what you're saying, and we'll be able to get answers.
I would love to. I'm on 5 committees in this Dáil. I'd love to make this a 6th.
This is the one you're talking about. This is the Transport Committee.
Agreed. I'm talking transport.
This is your key issue.
Yes.
So please come in.
I will.
We want to hear.
Can I just finish Deputy Troy's question? What would you do? I would send the Department of Transport off to Rockall to manage haddock quotas, because they're not doing their job. I'd send TII and the NTA and CIE and AAA and the entire lot of them with them. It needs to change.
I think
that's my view. That's my answer to the question.
Okay. Well, look, come here.
And can I say one last thing, one last point to the NESC? Because yes, I read your presentation, Mr. O'Connell, that you advise the Taoiseach, but you also have a national position. You're looked to for leadership around strategic public policy. I want you to come out, along with what Ms Daveney said here today, and call out correctly the failings in this report, and haul in those agencies and say, you're not thinking strategically, lads, and it is usually lads. You've got to change this. If this is an iterative process, which is the good thing in the governance thing, the first iteration is we throw out the transport section. Can we agree on that? And we start with proper thinking around how we promote walking and cycling and public. And we start with those two. And that's a difficult political thing to do, and it has to be top-down as well as bottom-up, because, to be honest, you can't do all this. Transport does require top-down. Like, we will not get a switch completely, which we should do, towards a car-sharing system if you don't get a direction from the centre to say that's what we're going to do. In 22, not in 25, that all those car parking spaces, they're going to be for car sharing, and we will not need 1 million new electric cars. We could do with 200,000 or 300,000 to do the job at the 1 million we're meant to be doing. OK, Volkswagen would lose a few bob on it, so be it. But we would gain as a country. Can we start being strategic, please? Can you start by showing some leadership in that, by being honest about what's the failing in the transport section in this plan?
OK.
When you were in government, though, that's
it was actually, Ruth. We did actually get a huge amount of agreement government.
We weren't even
Transport Minister.
I think Deputy Ryan is entitled to
read sustainable transport.
No, absolutely.
No. I want to try and keep this constructive. And as I say, I understand the concerns of everybody, and we all have the same concerns. I would like to say that what I hear from our witnesses is everybody together, all of us, have to deal with this. And that's really what I'm at here and you're at. And I think the collective wisdom of everybody, regardless of party or views, is what we want to move forward with. So I think constructively, what responding to, Mr. I don't expect you to comment on the political aspects, but on the, no, I don't expect you to comment on those, but on the generic issues, the important issues there. What should we be doing, particularly in view of what he said there in terms of transport policy?
So just to be very clear, I mean, I totally accept that NESC has a leadership position, and I think in the climate space in sort of 2012-13 we really worked hard to be in a leadership position in terms of some of the thinking around climate. And I'm just saying, as I come here today, I'm not in a position where I comment on the plan as Laura did. But I would certainly say to you that we would feel it would be a very good service to, and it would be in keeping with our leadership remit, to bring in and to have a discussion in NESC on the climate plan and then to form a view on that. And that's more powerful than me personally taking a position. I think it's NESC as the leadership, not me, and I think we will do that. I think it's key. It has been on our agenda. It has been on our agenda to bring, but the plan hasn't been done. So certainly we would take away from both the suggestions here today that we see the need for NESC to play its part in it. So we will do that.
Well, that's very positive.
And I look forward to meeting the other agencies here, Chair, and to look at the opportunity to question them on this plan and the patent failings in it.
Well, in fairness to all the agencies, whether they're in Rockall or wherever you want to send them, when they're in Leinster House, we're here, and you're always welcome to come in. Is that okay? Because that's the place to ask them the questions. Okay, sorry, yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Deputy Ryan. I just wanted to pick up on the not the detail, but the broad thrust of your intervention, and to note that in our report we are very strong on the need for not just bottom-up governance, but also top-down direction from central government. And I think the discussion we've had here this morning, because that bottom-up collaborative governance is lacking in a lot of cases. I think we've been drawn to that in our discussion, but I would like to put on record that in our report we see both as crucial parts of the governance jigsaw, both the bottom-up experimentation, learning, collaborative governance, but also the top-down direction from central government. So I think you're right to point that out, and our report endorses.
Could I just ask our witnesses then, if that's the end of the questioning, to thank you very much for your contributions, and to acknowledge your commitment to come back to us after your process is completed, particularly in terms of consultation. I welcome particularly your views on the committee getting involved more actively in transport, on the transport issues. Our role in that, I think, based particularly on Deputy Coppinger's proposal there, is a good start for us, to get stuck into that policy. So I want to thank you very much. I really appreciate your objectivity, your ideas, you're really thinking seriously about these issues, as we are as well. And I would then like to just say the Joint Committee is now adjourned until 1:30 p.m. on the 26th of June. So thank you.